All right, let's get started. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Jess Carson. I am a research assistant professor at the Carsey School of Public Policy at the University of New Hampshire. Joining us today, we have the co-authors of a fantastic new publication that was released earlier today on the inequities of job loss and recovery in the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm so excited and pleased to introduce Rogelio Saenz, who is a sociologist and demographer at the University of Texas at San Antonio, where he's a professor in the Department of Demography. He's also a senior fellow at the Carsey School. Welcome.
Thank you.
Also joining us is Dr. Corey Sparks, who is a statistical demographer, also at the University of Texas at San Antonio, where he's an associate professor, also in the Department of Demography. Welcome, Corey.
Thank you very much.
So thanks for taking the time. Let's just dive right in, I suppose. If folks have questions as we go through today's webinar, please feel free to drop them into the Q&A at the top of your screen, and we will take some time to answer those at the end. First, I thought maybe we would start at the top by talking a little bit about what motivated this work. Could you talk me through the key research or policy questions kind of undergirding this?
You want to take the lead, Corey?
Absolutely, sure. So Rogelio and I had both been interested in the nature of unemployment during COVID, especially around the issues of inequality, how race ethnic minorities were facing differential load in terms of the unemployment burden. And so we had both been looking at this from different angles. And since we were colleagues here, we decided to join up and take a look at this more holistically. And really the policy implications that we were really looking at was, what are the current on-the-ground conditions? So we tried to use the most current data we could possibly get in terms of the variation and inequality in unemployment. And then thinking about, okay, given the picture of unemployment that we're seeing right now, what kind of implications might the rent assistance programs ending, the food assistance programs ending, how might those things really start to play out in the next few months, given what we're seeing right now?
Yeah, I mean, that really could not be more timely, particularly with the policy climate right now. So that's really great. I wonder, perhaps Rogelio, perhaps you could talk us through some of the kind of main findings of the research brief, perhaps with an example or two.
Sure. So what we're interested in was looking at groups that had been impacted disproportionately. So we're talking about racial groups, particularly Latinos and African Americans. Gender, with respect to women, we find that women experience higher levels of unemployment. And one of the things is that right before the pandemic in February, women actually had lower levels of unemployment compared to males. But very quickly by March, by April, you really see the reverse, and men have held to the advantage there with respect to lower levels of unemployment. And then we also were looking at differences between immigrants and native-born, particularly for the Latino population. And one of the things that you find is that actually when it comes to overall, immigrants tend to be doing somewhat better than the native-born. And that has to do with a lot of the Latino immigrants are disproportionately represented among people who are on the front lines, people who are in essential industries and so forth. And so you see those kind of differences. But for women, Latina women, and particularly immigrant women, they've really sustained the highest levels of unemployment. Back in April, we're talking about unemployment rates of about 21%. So very major kind of trends that were taking place. And with respect to the racial disparities, one of the statistics that really stood out was that even though all of the groups, Latinos, African Americans, and whites, are making improvements in terms of the reduction of unemployment rates, you still have for African Americans and for Latinos, their unemployment rates in June were still higher than the peak unemployment of whites in April. So that shows the extent to which you really have a tremendous impact that we find with people of color. And once you start looking at those intersections, the intersection of race with gender and with nativity status and so forth, you see those major disparities that exist. And the other area that we're taking a look at has to do with somewhat of to what extent have the jobs that have been lost since February been recovered? And there we find those disparities as well. For African Americans, there are about 11.5% fewer jobs in June than there were in February. For Latinos, it's 12.3% fewer jobs in June than in February. And for whites, it's 7.5%. So still high, but much lower than the case of whites. And then you see those differences along gender lines as well.
I think that's a really important point that you've made too, that it's not just that the unemployment rates have spiked disproportionately, but then the recovery or the return of some of those jobs, those paces are uneven as well, so that we're not seeing the sort of rapid reinstatement of some of these workers of color the way that we might have seen in terms of the white unemployment rate dropping more quickly. And so I think that's a really important kind of perspective that your brief contributes as well. I wondered if you could, perhaps maybe speculate or extend from your data a little bit about what was some of the challenges might be facing Latino women in particular, given that, as we know, workers of color have been clustered in essential occupations or on the front lines. And I wondered, the rates among Latino women are just striking so high in April and continuing to be high. And I wondered if there was anything particular, maybe about the occupational makeup among that group, if that was sort of driving it, if you could speak to that group at all.
So for Latina women in particular, you look at the levels of education, they tend to be lower. You look at where women are more likely to be working, they're more likely to be working in the service sector or tourist-related kind of areas and so forth. So jobs that have been disappearing and that people are not being brought back in. So that really represents a major kind of challenge. And in the last month or so, we've seen the spikes take place throughout the South and the West, where businesses were opened prematurely across the states and so forth. We've seen those tremendous impacts. Here in Texas, in Arizona, in Florida, you're seeing those major spikes. Here in Texas now, Latinos represent the only state where Latinos account for more than half of the deaths among COVID cases here in Texas, and particularly down in the border area in the Rio Grande Valley. There, you've seen a tremendous increase in the spread of the virus and the deaths that are just that have been soaring in those particular areas. So you look at all these challenges. I mean, all groups are experiencing tremendous challenges, but particularly people who have traditionally been marginalized and so forth, people of color and women are being particularly hit hard. And once we see the CARES Act, unemployment benefits, extra $600 that has now disappeared, where we're talking about the lack of any kind of assistance. And as Corey mentioned, the challenges of people paying rent, for example, that they haven't paid a few months in many cases because people don't have jobs. And those represent a tremendous challenge. And then we're in August and we're seeing schools open. And that's another major issue having to do with here in Texas, as well as many other parts of the country. Schools are opening, so kids will be going to school, and you can just imagine the potential for another spike that is going to be taking place. And even if kids aren't in school, that they're going to be being educated from home, the challenges having to do with childcare and so forth. These are, and it hits people that are single parents, for example, that have lower resources and so forth, tremendously hard.
Or that may be working in different types of jobs as well. I mean, that's the thing, is like a lot of people who have lost their jobs have been in frontline industries that may not even have the option to be working from home. So
Right.
the whole build up in August to going back to school is going to be a major challenge for people in those types of professions.
Right.
Corey, I know you're kind of a spatial expert. Rogelio mentioned the role of certain states and the kind of unevenness of states reopening. And I did wonder if we could talk a little bit about the potential role of geography in your analysis, either from this work or your broader expertise. Do we have any sense of how the spatial patterning in infection rates or local industrial makeup or community, racial, and ethnic composition might affect some of these disparities that we're seeing in unemployment rates and recoveries?
So we can cite work out of Carsey. The previous research brief to ours that really examined how different states were disadvantaged in terms of what types of industries were being affected. And it really looks to me from examining those data that it is these frontline service-based, hospitality-based, food service type of industries that are really being hit predominantly hard. So in states such as Nevada, New York, Hawaii, places like that, California, Florida, places that are major tourist attractions, those industries are especially prominent in those states. So while I think that I think we have to dig a little bit deeper to see what sort of the spatial disparities look like. There are certainly a lot of inequality by states. Like for example, the state of Michigan, its unemployment rates for African Americans are still on the rise,
Mhm.
and there are a lot of other states such as Delaware, Louisiana, whose unemployment rates have not started receding. They are still either plateaued or increasing. So I think the work that's come out of Carsey before really highlights the sensitivity of the labor forces in these states to something like COVID, and I think I think those are going to be places where we're not going to see the recovery in the jobs until COVID really starts to recede, and that could be well. We're not talking about epidemiology right now, but it could be for some time to come.
Yeah.
I think
And
that certainly raises questions about those reopenings that Rogelio just mentioned, sort of
That's right.
case
yeah,
like school openings. Go
yeah.
ahead.
One more challenge has to do with the with for people who are lucky enough to have been getting health insurance through their job, as they're losing employment and so forth. All of a sudden, they're losing their health insurance as well. We know that there are still many states throughout the country that have not expanded Medicaid. Here, Texas, one of the major states where Latinos represent, about 30% don't have health insurance to begin with. The state of Missouri just recently did expand Medicaid, but that places another tremendous challenge on individuals. And along with the job loss, that's bad enough. But then, particularly in these very precarious times, then all of a sudden you don't have health care insurance as well.
I think you're really speaking to the nature of how intertwined some of these challenges are, that it's not just an unemployment issue. It's not just, a racial equity in unemployment issue, but that we're talking about all these other pieces in which different inequalities, like in access to health insurance and access to the type of job that allows you to work from home and access to childcare options or backup care or resources that would let you have that, how those pieces are all becoming kind of enmeshed together to create some really difficult situations for low-income workers, workers of color, women workers, which are certainly complicated by some of the other climates we're facing as a nation. So it's hard to talk about the racial and ethnic disparities in unemployment without also thinking about the other kinds of racial and ethnic disparities that our nation is facing. And I wondered if either of you had insight as to how policymakers should be thinking about these disparities in unemployment against a backdrop of disparities in infections and death of COVID among communities of color, or the increasing recognition of racialized violence in our nation, and all these sorts of other kinds of disparities that the pandemic, or broadly that the last several months have sort of made very evident. How should we understand these unemployment rates amid those sorts of backdrops.
Mhm. Yeah, so these are major kinds of issues that we know that we've had for generations and generations, centuries and centuries, very much deeply rooted in the formation of this country in terms of the structural racism and so forth. And a lot of people that have been trying to deny that it exists, I think it has become extremely apparent with respect to the outcomes of the pandemic and who has been impacted, who are the people who are dying, who are people that are being infected, and how that also interacts with the job security, health risks, the chronic conditions that put people more at risk, and so forth. And then we saw it, of course, as you mentioned, Jess, with respect to issues having to do with racial disparities of violence as well, the police brutality, the killing of George Floyd, and so forth. So it very much has provided kind of opening the venue to understand the racialized situation of inequality, and there has been calls for greater and greater degrees for politicians and for our community leaders to look at these disparities with a racialized and equity lens. And that's going to be the challenge. I think we saw early on, for example, as the people who were on the front line were disproportionately people of color, African Americans and Latinos, and people when they went to the grocery store and so forth, that's who were the people working there and so forth. And people had an appreciation of those individuals. And the same thing that happens with the police killing of George Floyd. Now the major question is going to be whether that uh, kind of good feelings that people have in terms of what we need to do, whether those are going to persist after the pandemic eventually goes away or not, or whether we go back to business as usual, which has always been the case, because we haven't had as long a period, but we've had episodic kind of situations. Katrina comes to mind, where people were saying, look at this racial disparities that we were unaware of, and things like that. And Katrina goes away, and then we continue doing business as usual. We know that the American public has a short a short memory when it comes to many of these things. So those are going to be the challenges, whether we're going to continue to reproduce these inequalities, or it's going to be a wake-up call that is going to represent how we function as a society and how we address issues of disparity.
Maybe this is a good time to sort of bring it back into the more narrow policy, perhaps implications of this work in particular. We talked a little bit about the expiration of the pandemic unemployment compensation. We talked a little bit about the implications of Medicaid and the lack of expansion in some states and the employer-sponsored health insurance losses that folks may be facing now as unemployment has risen. What are the policy implications of this work in particular for how we should understand what policies to implement and how we might make those recommendations to leaders at the state and the federal level?
Well, for me, I was pleased this morning as I was preparing some notes for the webinar to see that places like Chicago, places like Los Angeles are bringing about new funding for rental assistance programs, food security programs, things like that, that really have very practically minded issues for people that are facing housing insecurity, food insecurity. Those to me are the really pressing issues, because if people don't have a job right now, or if they're working greatly diminished hours, which we know it's like another side piece of this work that we haven't published yet, these are issues that will have major implications if these programs are not continued, especially in places that already have marginalized housing or food insecurity issues, which there's a tremendous spatial component to housing insecurity as well as food insecurity in this country. And those are two things to me that have to be realized by policymakers in order to either provide funds locally or at the state level. But these are things that absolutely must be looked at. Otherwise, you're going to have a major crisis beyond the unemployment and the COVID crisis on your hands.
And I would add to that the immigrant situation as well, the extent to which we're talking about immigrants have been completely shut out of the relief, the stimulus, the stimulus check, and even for an undocumented person, if he or she is married to someone who is a U.S. citizen, that person has also been shut off from those resources. The unemployment benefits, this extra $600 that existed last month and so forth, were not there for immigrant workers as well. So that's another major element. And we know that that many of these are homes that are mixed status, for example, that you have people, children that may have been born here in the United States and so forth. One spouse is a naturalized citizen, the other isn't, and so forth. So these are complicated kind of situations. But it is very clear that that in terms of the recovery, immigrants and particularly the undocumented are really down at the bottom with respect to the challenges that they have, and issues having to do with evictions, for example, the little bit of security that existed and so forth. Again, immigrants for the most part have been shut out from those relief efforts. We saw that California, for example, have put together some resources, but they're limited in terms of how much availability is there. That they were able to provide some assistance to immigrants, but that's another in terms of looking at the of the equity lens. Our presence of immigrants here, and how these are individuals that are really in the front lines, of, particularly when it comes to keeping food on our tables. We've seen the outbreaks of COVID cases and deaths in meatpacking industries, for example. We see agriculture, for example, that is another area where immigrants are disproportionately represented. But many of the other sectors that are related to transportation, distribution of goods and services, and so forth, that immigrants play a major role in keeping this country going.
One thing I think this work has done really well, and you are both doing really well right now, is helping to sort of shine a light on how these racial and ethnic disparities exist, but they are also reinforced by the policy choices that we're making as a nation, by the exclusion, for example, of immigrant or mixed status families from some of the supports that are available, to the structural housing issues that we know exist and continue to compound those kinds of disadvantages, and to really reinforce the structures that continue to perpetuate this disadvantage moving forward. So I think this work is particularly important for that reason. I see now that we have a question in the chat box, and if it's all right, I think I'll just read it to you. Sure. So it says, my question is, how is unemployment defined here? Is it being part of the labor force and not having a job? What if someone is not looking for a job and is not part of the labor force? So I think this is a really good question, because in usual times, there's a lot of confusion around what unemployment means. But now in the COVID era, there are some particular challenges around defining unemployment. This person also wonders if there is any breakdown on how these unemployed people are otherwise occupied. So I expect that perhaps means, whether they're caregiving or whether they are have dropped out of the labor force or experiencing illness. So maybe Corey, you could speak to that.
Sure. So we define unemployment as someone who is in the labor force, because those are two. That's what we're talking about here, is the difference between labor force participation and employment. So unemployed people that are in the labor force, so not students, not like stay-at-home moms that aren't working, things like that. Those people that are not in the labor force, these people that would either aren't currently working or are wanting to find a job and are not working. Those are like, in the CPS, it really codes that as two different types of people, and either working currently or not working and looking for a job. And that's really what we're using to define unemployment here. You could also look at labor force participation. That's more of a long-term trend, though. Those kind of decisions can often be not fluctuate so much month to month as employment status can. In terms of what they're currently doing, the CPS does ask a question in their monthly data on why you may have been unemployed in the past this month. And so you can look into that in terms of why these people aren't working. You know, they could have been injured, for instance, or they could have something else could have happened. You know, we're looking at this broadly in terms of, this is the COVID spike, and we're looking at unemployment broadly. You can certainly tease it apart like that. So that's how we're defining it here, which meets the literature's definition of how it's usually done. But we could also, Rogelio and I are digging into this, and we're looking at underemployment, we're looking at hours worked, we're looking at recent employment, because the CPS allows you to follow people across multiple months. And so some of the work we're doing right now is looking at the sort of longitudinal nature of the data, so you can actually see individual changes in employment month to month. And a lot of the patterns that we documented here, sort of the Black and Latino disadvantage, also holds when you're looking at people that are returning to the labor force. Whites are more advantaged in that regard, while Blacks and Hispanics and Latinos are less likely to return to the labor force if they were unemployed last month.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And historically, traditionally, you see the dynamic nature of the civilian labor force, that people move in, people move out, and so forth. And one of the things that we did look at was the change since February to the present. And there, in particular, it has been Latina and African American women that you see a reduction in terms of the civilian labor force, white women to a certain extent. And there was an article that I just caught my eye. I think it was yesterday, Corey, that I had sent you the link to that were showing that that the pandemic has had, in terms of its gender disparities, that women are more likely to be leaving the labor force in this, all of a sudden, that they lose their job. But now there's also the kids are at home, for example, or they're caring for an older parent, and so forth, and all of a sudden, so that takes place. One interesting finding that we observed was with African American men, that they tend to be the ones that experienced the least decrease in labor force participation. Again, that may be people still are moving in and out, but it's just the net value. But it's something to look at. And I think whites were about 1% or so. I think African Americans was about 0.2% decline or so. And for Latina and African American women, we're talking about a 2.5% or so decline in their labor force participation.
I'm so pleased to hear of the different ways that you're going to continue to explore this topic. I'm really looking forward to continuing to follow your work moving forward. I don't want to run over onto anybody's time, so I'm going to hold it there for now and say thank you so much to both of you for making the time to talk with me today. I've really enjoyed reading your research and having a chance to explore a little deeper with you. I want to point out that you can access this publication or any of our others at carsey.unh.edu/publications. If the authors have anything that they would like to add about any of their additional work or forthcoming items, please feel free.
You can access all the data and code that we use to do our analysis at my GitHub site, github.com/CoreySparks.
And I've been doing a monthly blog on the Latino COVID cases and deaths, and this can be found in Latino Decisions in their webpage in the blog area. So each month I've been producing a blog.
I can't wait to check it out. Thank you both so much for joining me, and thank you to all our audience participants. We appreciate your attendance today, and we will see you soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.